Hello. Welcome to African in New York. Today we are very lucky to have Kenneth Goodwin Jr. Welcome to the studio, Kenneth.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, Dion.
All right. So Kenneth is the managing principal of Jeanensis Capital Markets. He is also the Aspen Institute Nakasone Scholar, and he is also the scholar of Maureen and Mike, which has to do with Asia and Japan. I know that Kenneth could explain this better than I do. So why can't you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Let me talk a little bit about the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. It's named after the former ambassador, Mr. Michael Mansfield, who's pretty well recognized in Japan. He was during the President Kennedy administration. And the Mansfield Foundation is pretty much responsible. It's working under the State Department, and it brings individuals who work within the government to go to Japan to work in their counterparties. As for myself, I had a great opportunity to work at the Bank of Japan under the former chairperson, Mr. Fukui. Also worked at the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So I had a chance to monitor trades, Japanese government bonds on the Tokyo Stock Exchange trading floor, as well as work on the listing department. I was able to work within that function to bring in U.S. corporations who were delisting from the exchange and brought them back on the exchange using what they call a triangle merger scheme. And essentially what that is that's tying up with another entity, domestic firm in Japan, to help them list on the exchange. And one of the major corporations we did was Citigroup. I also work at the Japan FSA, which was fun, and that's the major regulatory body in Japan, overseeing a lot of the banks and insurance industry. And my final rotation was within the Japanese Diet. And there at the Japanese Diet, I had the opportunity to work with the Honorable Hayashi Sensei. And essentially that gave me the opportunity to work with the post-reform system in Japan. So that was a great chance for me to work at the Mike Mansfield Foundation. Jeanensis Capital Markets pretty much was a firm that was created about 8 years ago here in the U.S. And essentially the idea was to do foreign direct investment strategy. The true focus was on the Asian markets. That includes China, Japan, Vietnam, all those countries in Japan, in Asia. And the idea was to target certain industries. We were going to target nanotechnology, biotechnology, transportation, gender-based industries that was looking to actually do operations not only here in the U.S., but also in Japan. Over the years, we pretty much changed our strategy. The strategy has gone back more strategic focus. In the past couple of months, our clients includes the city of Detroit, where we're focusing more on advanced manufacturing. Given that Detroit is, as you know, automobile-based city. We also wanted to concentrate on back office operations on the financial services side. That's an area that Detroit was really, really interested in. And we also were looking in terms of the actual information technology, which a lot of industries, a lot of economic development corporations are gearing towards and cities are looking at. So pretty much that's one of the areas that I tend to build out for Jeanensis Capital Markets.
All right. So good. So we know that you are a specialist in Japanese financial capital markets, and you also have the experience with other Asian countries. And the reason why you are here today actually is because we want to talk about the Africans and how they can, collaborate with the Chinese and the Japanese investors. And then because of your experience with the Bank of Japan and the Japan capital markets, you may know the Japanese development strategy. And I'm sure that you also know the Chinese development strategy. And both of these countries involved in African politics. And, so the first thing that I want you to do is to compare the Japanese development strategy and the Chinese development strategy, and how do you think that it works for Africa?
I think that's a very good question there, and it's a very good leeway. There's two different approaches. You see a slight differences between China in terms of how they look at Africa and the way that Japan looks at Africa. Looking at China, China traditionally had a history, the Sino-African experience, where China went in more on the source side, really focusing mainly on the political, building out political relationships. And that's geared towards working with governments, heads of governments, working with organizations, specific organizations, and then targeting the resources that are in place, which are, you know, the natural resources, that's being oil, that's being commodities. Also at the same time, building out the infrastructure. And building out the infrastructure meaning building out roads and bridges, schools and so forth. So that was the China approach. Japan had a little bit more different approach. Japan approach was more diplomatic in the sense where Japan always wanted to look at it from a lending-based perspective. And the idea with Japan was it wanted to focus on particular industries. As you know, Japan is an island nation, so in that sense, a lot of the goods and services, or certain goods and services, had to be pretty much imported from Africa. So from the standpoint like cocoa and so forth, those things you're not going to basically find in Japan, but had to be brought in to Japan from Africa. So Japan was really, really important from the standpoint of building a long-term relationship, because there was a demand from the Japanese people to get those goods and services. So their standpoint was to sit back and say, let's look at our relationship. Let's build our strategy towards certain industries. Those industries being commodities, those industries being technology, those industries being the raw materials to use to build technology. And let's maintain those relationships. China is a little bit more unique in a sense, where China will pick and choose particular countries. And what they do is they advocate their leadership at the top level. Now the question that you have today is whether or not that's trickled down to the actual villages and individuals. That remains to be seen with Africa. But China has always promoted a sense that it's not going to use this westernized dot to build out their capitalism. China has always looked at it from the standpoint, let's look at economic development in terms of core level, and that's being at the base level.
So in that sense, would you say that the Chinese are more of like an opportunistic kind of development partner, and the Japanese are more of the, I would say, diplomatic partner as far as the development strategies are concerned?
Exactly. From what I get from my clients is that because there's a lot of liquidity from China, you do see more opportunities, and there's this opportunistic strategy that's being used. A lot of my clients come back to me and ask, they wonder, what's the strategy? Where are they putting this money towards, and why are they putting this money towards certain operations? Where Japan, if you look in terms of Japan's strategy, it's a longer process. There's a due diligence in place to receive any kind of liquidity. So it takes a while for you to receive some kind of response towards any kind of development or investments, and that's a big difference. The Chinese tend to be a lot more quicker in terms of making a decision towards investments. The Japanese will sit back and put a little bit more thought into it. And I think a part of that has to do with not just to complete the deal and get the deal done, but also at the same time in terms of looking at our long-term relationships. Keep in mind, relationships changes. So I think the Japanese will sit back and think about those changes in the relationships, where the Chinese will look at it from a short-term perspective and hopefully build it out in the long term.
Yeah, so do you think like the Japanese and the Chinese are in competition as far as their development strategies are concerned?
Oh, I think wholeheartedly. As much as they need each other, actually. One cannot live without the other. And it's ironic that you say that, because that's very important. They are very interconnected. A lot of Japanese businesses do business in China. A lot of Chinese business people like to do business in Japan. So there's some synergies in terms of where they operate in industry. So they really do need each other. But they also realize in order for them to survive as a country, in terms of bringing in economic development or foreign direct investment, they're going to have to compete against each other to a certain level. And Africa is a prime target for that. Some cases they may say Africa is a frontier market. That's a term that you hear nowadays. I look upon it and I say, what is a frontier market? Because Africa's been around for a long period of time, so it can't really be frontier if the goods and services or the natural resources are there. The Japanese will look at it and say, from a long-term perspective, how can we keep those reserves, how can we keep those resources going for a longer period of time? But the Chinese are looking at it from the standpoint of keeping their GDP at a certain level. We have a large amount of people that we have to feed and provide jobs. How can we extract that now to develop products and services and keep our country operating at a very high level?
So you advise different private and governmental agencies on Chinese and Japanese development strategies, and one of the things that you do is you help them raise funds, and then you help them as well to execute the different strategies they design. And I know, at one point people said there is a scramble for Africa, and now some people think like the Chinese involvement in Africa could be another way of scramble for Africa, if I can say that way. Now, Africa is full of resources, and everywhere the Chinese people go to invest, they go where there are those natural resources. I'm talking about gas, I'm talking about oil, I'm talking about other minerals. The Chinese are there and they're investing. Now, is there any need for Africans to start worrying about the Chinese involvement in Africa?
I think the Africans need to really, and I like to go back to the term frontier, because I think working on Wall Street for a long period of time in my life, about 20 years of my life, you notice the terms emerging markets, frontier, and these are, Africans have to be very, very cognizant of these different code words, because these code words are being used by asset managers to go in and basically invest in those areas. To say that Africa is a frontier market, it's a nomenclature of what it actually is. Africa's been around for a long period of time. It's been able to provide the world with natural resources and goods and services for centuries. So I think we move beyond frontier itself. Africans got to be very, very aware anytime when anyone comes in their country to invest. I mean, that's just typical foreign direct investments. Who's doing it, what's the purpose behind it, and why? And the reason why that is because you want to see what's their purpose behind it. What's driving them to actually go in and cause these investments? Does it benefit the people? Does it benefit the countries that you're actually abstracting those, as you mentioned, the gas, oil, natural minerals, resources? Does it benefit the people? Are the people able to actually get jobs and create opportunities themselves? So in a sense with China, I think Africans have to sit back and say, okay, they're building out roads, they're also building out highways and schools and so forth, but is it the Africans who are doing it, or is it the Chinese who are doing it? And one of the things that you find in the development, at least the infrastructure development of African, at least in certain nations, is the Chinese who are actually doing it. So the Chinese, at least the Chinese government, have to sit back and, from a foreign policy standpoint, and say, okay, we have our Chinese natural citizens who are now in Africa, who are building these roads and bridges and these schools and so forth. Now we have to find a way to protect them, right? And there's a distinct difference between that and Japan. Japan will not do that because Japan self-defense forces are not allowed to do that, actually. So it's written in their constitutions where their self-defense forces can't really do that. And they don't have the size to do it, where the Chinese do have a size to do it. So you can see the purpose behind what's driving China in their development towards Africa. And Africa has to sit back and say, okay, how do we take these resources and make our own opportunities? So the circulation of money, going back to how do you develop opportunities in any community, is through the circulation of money. So if the money stays in the community, if we take those resources and we create our own products and services, we're able to develop jobs. And in developing that jobs, that can help to increase the household income. And that increase savings, and of course that increase the gross domestic GDP production of a country. So that's the way Africa has to look at it. We have to go back to the table and say, okay, we have the resources, now let's see what we can do for ourselves first. And then maybe if we create a fund, and you can invest in the fund, we still have equity stake in the fund, but we're willing to give you anywhere between maybe 5 to 10% equity stake, but we still own about 90% equity stake. So that has to change tremendously.
We're talking about Africa being one of the emerging markets, really, in one way or the other. And before that, Africa has implemented a lot of reforms, economic reforms, financial sector reforms, governmental reforms, tax reforms, and all of this came with the Washington Consensus, which was part and parcel of the neoliberal globalization agenda of the IMF and the World Bank. And a lot of people have been arguing about this, saying that reforms worked up to a certain point. Some people say, no, it didn't work at all. The effects have been not good. And, of course, the economic development that they are talking about is only the economic growth. The GDP went up, and but the poor has remained poor, and the rich has increased his wealth and is much more wealthier than he was before the Washington Consensus. So now they are saying, China coming in, saying, maybe let's try a different thing, because China seems to offer another option. Maybe working with China would help us move from this level of development to another level of development, because Chinese technology is easy to copy. So it's a lot of issues here surrounding the Washington Consensus strategy and now what they are calling the Beijing Consensus strategy. So if you compare the Washington Consensus strategy and the Beijing Consensus strategy, how do you see Africa, with the new way of thinking that comes from China? Is it going to be better than the Washington Consensus?
Gives it leverage. Anytime when you, True, gives it leverage. Anytime when you add another person to the table, to the party, it makes it more fun. And it provides a leverage base for African nations. As you mentioned, China approaches the AIIB, their bank that they're actually looking to target, to actually go against or to compete against the IMF and the World Bank.
I was coming to that question.
And that's very important. I mean, the TPP talks that we had here in the U.S. Was based, and a lot of people didn't talk about the AIIB. But the AIIB is really instrumental, because if you look at the countries that supported it, you had Germany that supports it, you had France that supported it, and even Japan to a large degree never really said no to it. They sat back and they understood the significance behind it. The Chinese put over about $55 billion in their own assets into this bank. So that tells the world that this is a very serious instrument. This is a very serious foreign operation, government service entity that is looking to invest in certain industries, in certain countries, in certain sovereign wealth funds. So it's looking to really, really kind of shape the way you do business now for cross-border deals and foreign direct investments. And that's good from Africa, because now that gives Africa another leverage, another talking ground to say, hey, look, we don't really have to rely on the IMF. The notion of the past was the IMF and the World Bank has over-leveraged Africa. So it choked Africa from its own investments. So now you had to pay back the loans, and the interest on those loans are very high. So, and the government in itself didn't have enough reserves to actually do it. So the other development side, at least the internal infrastructure, was not being done. The roads and the bridges couldn't have been built because they had to go back and build those monies and use those money towards the allocation for the IMF loans. So it changes the way dynamics of, one, how do you approach Africa? Because now Africa is being approached more with a handshake than before. And the Africans had to recognize that. They have to sit back and say, okay, we're now looked upon a little bit more differently. Because when you look at the typical emerging markets and you look at the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, they're collapsing. And then if you look at the first period, the BRICS. You look at Brazil and Russia and India and China and Singapore. Singapore is pretty much a solid economic GDP growth. They're pretty solid across the way. India has gone somewhat. China's going through some issues. Brazil has had some problems. So that you can see that there's substantial challenges across different economies around the globe. So the next step is to look at Africa. So now Africa they can come to the table and say, hey, look, we have other ways to look at financing and getting the liquidity. So now that we do have this opportunity to work with the Chinese, we're able to go to the table and say, hey, we have some opportunities across different industries, that being natural resources, that being commodities, which is really strong, what the Chinese really need. So let's rebargain ourselves, repackaging ourselves, and come to the deal or the table a little bit more differently. In that sense, the Japanese, or excuse me, the Africans actually own that particular deal itself. And I think that's going to work in the benefit of Africa if the Africans are willing to share that amongst the people.
When you say the ownership of the deal, the African countries were disturbed by the conditionalities of the World Bank and the IMF at one particular point, and then they decided to, create what they call joint assistance strategies for aid that they receive, which was like the, ownership of reforms and ownership of the aid that come from any of the development partner. So they did that. So, so now they had to create a kind of a partnership. When you talk about the development and aid, there are two things that come in my mind. One is soft power, and the other one is hard power. What I mean by that is that soft power is when you, as a country, even if you don't have the resources, you still have a way to, own the development strategy and, negotiate to get a good deal. But the hard power is when that somebody dictates, like you should do this and do that and do that, and everything comes in the development package. You have both. Some countries just say this is what we want to do, that's it, or maybe we may negotiate and you may get some of the things that you want. So is this kind of development politics? Can we call this a mismatch of power between the donor and the recipient, which in this sense is Africa? And then how do you see the Chinese and the Japanese strategies in terms of the soft and the hard power?
Well, we would have to look at the United Nations. That's a prime example of it being used by at least China, more so than Japan. And the Chinese have actually used that to their benefit to a large degree, where the African nations have been their best allies in terms of human rights issues, right? So you have, in terms of the African nations, really not really saying too much for the Chinese in terms of their violation for human rights, and that's occurring at the United Nations. So in that sense, with soft power, the African nations have to realize that every vote carries a certain amount of weight to it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be within their homeland country in terms of the political regime. It could be within organizations. It could be within the African Development Bank. It could be within APAC. It could be within Sino-China relations, Sino-African relations. It could be in any different forum that you have. The Africans who are sitting there have to realize that that vote carries some weight. So in a sense, where the Chinese are coming from, they're looking at it from the standpoint of trying to really make a point on the world stage. There's a huge difference between Japan and China from that standpoint. Japan knows it's not ready. Doesn't want to be. Japan doesn't want to be in the forefront of the world. Japan would rather, if Japan had to choose its choice in the world, it would rather stick to dealing with the issues that it have in terms of the high growth rate, in terms of individuals becoming older, an older population, in terms of trying to get women more involved. So you had the sense of Abenomics, now womenomics, where the women are actually being a part of the society more in terms of productivity, in terms of getting the GDP to grow up a little bit more, in terms of trying to get inflationary pressure on the economy, which has been very deflationary for a very long time. So Japan has been in a muddle for the past 20 years from economic development. It's really been kind of just struggling along, kind of crawling along, and yet it's still maintained third ranking in the world. So it's really trying to find ways to say, how do we actually build some excitement in our economy, bring investments back, bring Japanese back in terms of what's making it more attractive for foreign investors to go in, and yet uplift our people. Where the China understands from the standpoint that this is a great opportunity for China to really to improve not only domestically, which is what it has been doing over the years with GDP ratio between 5 to 7%, but also at the same time to use that to leverage across the globe in terms of different forums, and the United Nations being one of them. Africa actually has been a solid partner to China on that. African nations have to be very careful in that sense, where it needs to sit back and say, hey, China has its own strategy too. China wants to go in and it wants to influence certain organizations and also develop its own influence around the globe. Do we really want to be a part of that kind of big goal or objective that China has for itself? It may not work in a way for African nations. So in that sense, African nations, and to go back to what you're saying, in a way, certain countries have gotten it right. Certain countries recognize that. Certain countries said, okay, we need to sit back. We know what their objectives are. So we're not going to allow ourselves to lose that political strength that we normally have. So we're not just going to give that up. Other countries have fallen into that trap, thinking that they're part of this movement. And oftentimes what happens when you have change, people fall into a trap that are being laid. So in that sense, those countries already fell into the trap of providing the leverage to the Chinese nations.
So we've been talking about these economic issues and politics and everything, and now let's come back to your organization, your company, and whoever you're working with, because it's also important for the audience to know what your company does in all this global politics, and if they need your advice, because you're also a consultant, the financial advice that you can give them. So how do they get in touch with you?
Sure, and thank you for this opportunity. We're Jeanensis Capital Markets. You can reach me directly at Kenneth Goodwin at Jeanensis, JEANENSIS.net. And Jeanensis, the unique thing about the name, when I created Jeanensis, I was reading Genesis, the first chapter in the Bible. So Jeanensis has a very spiritual connectedness to it. And it is a mixture of my mother's first name, Jeanette Dyer, and Asia actually was our target audience. So the notion of putting those three together, we create Jeanensis. And what we're doing now, one of our clients is the Tokyo Stock Exchange. We're talking to the Tokyo Stock Exchange about Japanese government bonds forwards. The idea of selling that option here across different organizations, different companies, because Japan has a huge amount of JGBs in the marketplace. We're also working with JETRO, which is the Japan Exchange Trade Organization, that's responsible for foreign direct investments back to Japan, but also here in the U.S., and building out their strategy in certain industries that they're looking at, green technology, transportation being one of them, being that Japan is really big on the development and research and development for transportation in itself. And we're also working with other smaller firms and raising capital. So eventually they may be able to be listed on the exchange, if not here in the U.S., also in Asia. So we're looking at those different areas, those different opportunities. Strategy is one of the things that we like to do. Execution is another thing that we also like to do in terms of executing the plan itself, and raising capital, which is sourcing for individuals, those individuals being venture capitalists as well as angel investors who may have an interest in your firm. So we tend to look at more mature firms, firms that have a balance sheet and income statement in place, cash flow, which is what everyone likes to look at, how much cash flow and the earnings that you earn over time, and whether or not those investors are going to be interested in investing in your firms. Of course, everyone wants to look at it from an equity standpoint. Your firm may not be ready for that yet. So we tend to look back and say, okay, maybe you come back 2 or 3 years when you actually have enough revenues in place and you have enough value and enough equity in stake, so you can actually trade off a little bit of equity in terms of the investors. And then from there, we'll take you cross-border to see if there's any other foreign investors that may have an interest in that. Work with some of our partners. And that tends to be really good when you work with foreign investors and foreign partners, because they tend to bring a different table, a different set of options to the table. So that's the gist of it.
Well, so this is African in New York, where we welcome people of African origin to narrate their stories of success to New Yorkers, because we believe it's important for the audience to know about what is happening in New York, and this comes from New York City. So thank you very much for coming today, Goodwin.
Thank you very much for having me today.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.
So, I mean, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.